The campaign of 2024 is taking something of a breather today to commemorate the D-Day landings 80 years ago. And quite right, too. After all, if the Nazis had had their way, we wouldn't be having a general election or any other democratic freedoms we too often take for granted. So it's more than fitting that we spend some time thinking of those who sacrificed so much to defend our way of life. They were the greatest generation. Every subsequent generation has been forever in their debt. The British default these days is to downplay our achievements and diminish our successes. Moreover, so much of D-Day and many other history things these days is seen through the American cultural prism. Think The Longest Day, Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers. You take these two factors together and we too often fail to appreciate the scale of the British contribution to the liberation of Western Europe from the Nazi yoke. Sometimes you think we just had a walk-on part. Of course, we couldn't have done it without our American allies. But on this fateful day, all these years ago, it was the Royal Navy which played by far the dominant role in ferrying the largest amphibious military force the world has ever seen across the Channel. It was the RAF which provided pretty much all of the air cover for the invasion. And along with our Canadian allies, there were more British Commonwealth than American troops hitting the Normandy beaches. It's also worth remembering why it was necessary in the first place. As the dictators flexed their muscles in the 1930s, we often, too often, looked away, appeased, refused to rearm. The despots concluded we were weak and that they could pretty much do what they wanted. These failures meant that in the end, to see them off, we had to expend far more blood and treasure than if we'd stood up to them in the first place. Echoes of today? The dictators are on the march again, threatening democracy from Ukraine to Taiwan, South Korea to the Baltic states. And in this election campaign, our leading politicians are arguing if we should spend an extra 0.1 or 0.2% of our GDP on defence. It hardly seems an adequate response to the threats at hand. There's been much derision about the ignorance of younger folk when it comes to the significance of D-Day, and sometimes their lack of knowledge is truly mind-blowing. But it's not clear that the current generation of politicians are truly across their history books either, or wise to the lessons therein. It's time they were, and time they rose to the occasion. Remember, D-Day is what you have to resort to when deterrence fails. We're coming to the end of the second week of the campaign now. Give us an overview of where you think we are.
Well, I don't know what you think, but I think this week has confirmed what a lot of us always believed to be true, which is that Labour will win the next general election, but not because Sir Keir Starmer will be lots of people's choice and great hope for the future, largely because the Conservative Party has disintegrated, partly because of 14 years in power, but also because it is fighting with itself in large part. I think we saw that in the debate. I think Sir Keir Starmer was flat-footed. I don't think he expected the way the Prime Minister would tackle that.
He was a bit ponderous at times, wasn't he?
And I wonder, I don't know what you think about this. You've seen these people in action a lot more than I have over the years. I got the impression that Keir Starmer thought it made more sense not to engage with that kind of number because he thought it gave it too much credibility. But I think he misunderstood how political those debates can be, which sounds very strange maybe to people listening, how you could not be very good at politics. But the reality is neither Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer are that good at politics. And I think that's showing.
It's true. What do you make so far? Because whatever you think of Mr. Farage, he did liven up the campaign by announcing he had staged an internal coup to take over reform again, and he was running for Parliament again. And actually, he may have a better chance this time. Who knows? We'll see. But what do we think now will be the impact of... because obviously reform is more energised with Nigel Farage back at the helm.
Totally. I was at that launch event. He played a clip of it. And I really did have to pinch myself when I listened to the former party leader, Richard Tice, announcing the future of the party would be that he was replacing himself. That was a real moment. Nigel Farage has energised this campaign. Reform are hoping that they can translate that into MPs. I think that's much more difficult than lots of people realise. I don't think Reform will get a huge number of MPs at this election. But what I think they will do is hold the Conservatives' feet to the fire in two ways. They'll make it difficult for them to win seats against Labour in some areas. Labour will probably come out on top because of this decision. I also think it will make the rebuilding of the Tory party afterwards much harder. A YouGov poll yesterday changed methodology, but they have explained why they've changed that and what that means. Showed Reform on 17 points, Tories on 19. Tories have never polled in a general election less than 30 points ever. So this is real groundbreaking territory now if that translated into a general election result.
Do we have any idea, Kate, where the campaign goes from here?
Well, I mean, we're at a bit of a pause today because of D-Day,
Because
as
of
you
D-Day,
said.
of course, quite right.
And both Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak are there at the commemorations. We are going to see manifestos next week. So I think there'll be a bit more campaigning tomorrow, a bit of quiet over the weekend. We've got that big debate on Friday night, remember, worth just mentioning
That's
that.
a BBC debate, yeah.
It is, but without the political leaders. But Farage will have a chance to step up, and Penny Mordaunt will be there for the Tories, and Angela Rayner for Labour. So it should be worth a watch. Over the weekend, a bit more quiet, and then we'll get into the manifestos, which is where we get into that real detail of what everybody's going to do. That's a big week next week.
And we don't know yet whether there'll be anything new in the manifestos, do we? In fact, I saw some briefing from Labour saying, "Oh, don't expect anything surprising. We're not going to do anything."
Which I'm sure won't please their shadow cabinet team.
No.
Because without any big policy announcements, you don't have very much wriggle room in terms of raising money to make real change. And that's going to make things difficult for West Streeting in health and also in local government. You know, we're talking about social care a lot today, the Liberal Democrats are. That's a huge amount of cash that needs to come from somewhere. If Labour doesn't have a plan on that, it might not look very inspiring. The Tories, I'm told, have one big thing left to talk about. So
Because
we'll
in a
wait
way,
to see
they've
that.
got nothing to lose.
Exactly. And they can put pressure on Labour by announcing things and then challenging Labour to match it. And if they don't, a bit like pensions, it looks like Labour are not on the front foot.
All right, we shall see. Kate McCann, thanks for being with us. That was the sound in Tory headquarters last night as a YouGov poll landed showing Reform, as Kate was saying there, breathing down the Tories' neck. It put Reform at 17%, just 2 points behind the Conservatives at 19%. Labour, of course, was still on track for a landslide. The sound emanating from Tory HQ this morning was a sigh of relief. An Ipsos poll put Reform on only 9%, well behind the Tories on 23%. Labour, of course, was still heading for a landslide majority. Joining me now, Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University and polling guru, Sir John Curtice. John, good to talk to you again.
Good to talk to you, Andrew.
Let's stick with this possibility. It's only that one poll, and the poll coming out this morning is very different, shows Reform.
But this morning's poll, Andrew, was done before night, for the most part, before night's announcement. Whereas the YouGov poll is all afterwards, right?
Then I'm warming to my theme. Let's look at this possibility in which the more polls begin to show Reform breathing down the Tory neck, and maybe a couple of polls next week coming out showing in terms of share of the vote, Reform has overtaken the Tories into second place. What, John, is the tipping point when that transfers into real seats for the Reform Party?
To be honest, Andrew, I've not ever attempted to calculate that number, but I guess, given how evenly spread Reform's vote is likely to be and that what's left of the Conservative Party are very safe seats, I suspect it would require the Reform Party to be quite a long way ahead of the Conservatives. In a sense, it reminds me of the debate in 1983 about whether or not the Liberal SDP alliance could overtake Labour. Well, the truth is, even if they had overtaken Labour in terms of votes, and in the end they didn't, they certainly would have struggled to overtake them in terms of votes, again, because their votes was too geographically evenly spread. And at the moment, I have to say, I think the importance of this doesn't really lie in can Reform overtake the Conservatives, as opposed to how much more difficult has this made it for the Conservatives to have any chance of narrowing the lead that Labour have over them. It was already the case during this campaign, and maybe it's one of the things that persuaded Nigel Farage to enter it, that support for Reform was not being squeezed by the Conservatives. Indeed, by the time Nigel Farage made his announcement, support for Reform was already running at above where the Brexit Party stood at the same stage back in 2019. And if the YouGov poll basically shows there's been a 3-point increase in Reform support since its last poll before Mr. Farage's announcement. That's in line with what hypothetical polling has said might happen if Mr. Farage were to come to lead to reform. But here we also then have to remember YouGov have tended to have a relatively high reform number and a relatively low conservative number. So perhaps if anybody was going to get reform that close to the Conservatives, they would like to do so. But the crucial point is this. If in the end, all that Nigel Farage does is to stop the reform vote being squeezed, and they can end up with about 10% of the vote. So even if they do lose some ground between now and polling day, that is very bad news for the Conservatives, because we know two things. One, most of the people who said they're going to vote for reform voted for the Conservatives in 2019. Two, we also know from the local elections that it is unlikely that if reform were not on the ballot paper, that those people would vote Conservative, because in those wards where reform stood in the local elections, it was the Conservatives who suffered and not Labour. So those two things mean that reform are undoubtedly likely more damage to the Conservatives. And where are they most likely to do damage? Well, it's in seats that the Conservatives are trying to defend for two reasons. One, because these tend to be more pro-Leave seats, so therefore reform do better. But two, remember the Brexit Party did not contest Conservative-held seats in 2019. So anything that reform get is a plus from zero. And one of the reasons why those MRP polls, which have attracted a lot of interest in the last 2 or 3 days, are showing the Conservatives so low in terms of seats, even though they're not particularly remarkable polls in terms of share. One of the reasons is because they're saying reform are going to do better in Conservative held seats. That is going to damage the Conservatives, in particular in seats they're trying to defend. So however you look at it, Nigel Farage's intervention, if we kind of don't necessarily have such high expectations that he's going to transform the dynamics of right-wing politics in the UK, even we are much more modest in what reform might achieve, they could still do an awful lot of trouble to the Conservatives' prospects.